Thank you, Gordon, for this opportunity to be in the zone with so many of the key thought leaders and decision makers in the critical materials space. As a start, quick comment on where I'm coming from. As Gordon said, I spent some time in government at the White House and at the Pentagon. I'm now on the outside, have been for a good long while, and I serve on the advisory boards of companies developing U.S. sources of a dozen of the metals and minerals that are on the U.S. critical list, and one of those being Rio Tinto in their U.S. operations. So the points I want to share today come from my efforts to bring a public policy perspective to private sector projects. Think of it this way. Is there a way to align a private project to key public policy goals in a way that would advance the interests of both? If it sounds simple, as many of you know, it's anything but. Try as it might, the private sector has a very hard time meshing to the pace of government policymaking. I'm being diplomatic here. And policymakers have nothing in their mandate that requires them to appreciate, to really feel the pressures of private sector competition. Same planet, different worlds. But as we're seeing here today, the critical minerals challenge is a huge challenge. And if we're collectively going to meet it, private sector leaders and policymakers, public policymakers, are going to have to perform a thought experiment, a shift in mindset to see the challenges from both sides and find the common ground to move forward. Critical minerals is a huge challenge. It's so often said today. Sometimes it helps to take a step back and really appreciate that. Much of human progress was built, literally, with a handful of metals and minerals. It goes back to the early markers of human progress. We had the Bronze Age, copper and tin, and the Iron Age followed. Geologically, the rest of the periodic table was ready and waiting, but we, as human makers, we had no use for it. It's different now. Take the U.S. critical minerals list, 35 metals and minerals, but really as elements, it's more than that. The rare earths count as 2, scandium gets its own mention, not 17, and the PGMs count as 1, not 6. Add them all in, and the U.S. list grows from 35 to 55. But wait, there's more. If we overlay on top the U.S. list the Australian and the Japanese and the EU critical lists, and we add the unique elements there, we get 10 more. We're at a total of 65 in all. We're sneaking up on 2/3 of the naturally occurring elements on the periodic table. You look at what's not on the list, you kind of feel bad for hydrogen and oxygen, feeling a little left out. Welcome to the tech metals age, where we need a lot of different elements and a lot of each of them. I said the challenge was huge, that's one part of it, the sheer number of metals and minerals. And think of the average senator, congressperson navigating this issue. You're basically asking them to create laws or move policy that just takes into account 2/3 of the periodic table. The second part is what I call the co-product challenge. We've heard a lot about these issues today. Our language has to change here. We used to talk about certain deposits having byproducts. We used to talk about minor metals. Those terms don't fit anymore. Example, you have a rare earth project in Texas, Round Top, with considerable Australian investment, I might add, and it has the full range of rare earths, but it also has lithium for EV batteries, it has uranium, it has beryllium, as we just heard about, and it has gallium for supercomputing chips. What's minor? What's a byproduct? Different application, different answers. And technology, material science, will drive demand over time and change those answers over time. So we've got to think of co-products. How can we extract all of the useful metals and minerals from each deposit? Take copper, for instance, which isn't even on the US or Australian lists. It's the gateway to tellurium and rhenium, sometimes cobalt, perhaps even the rare earths. If you need any of those, then copper, too, is critical. Then the third challenge. As we've heard here today, each metal and mineral requires its own supply chain. There's not a lot I can add to that, but this is scores of supply chains, not just to bring them out of the ground, but to process them into advanced materials needed for all manner of tech apps. So in the rare earths, certainly, but elsewhere as well, we're seeing private sector players reaching out to partners, building their own supply chains. This is much more challenging than simply developing a mine. Finally, the fourth challenge. While all that digging is going on, what's going on above ground? Geopolitics. The tech metal age is going to redefine geopolitics. We'll see the emergence of a new group of countries, tech metal haves and tech metal have-nots. The good news is that Australia and the US are among the haves, because being among the have-nots is not going to be a happy place to be. My flight from Washington connected through Qatar. It's an amazing place. Literally castles built in the sand, built by energy resources. In all since 1940, the date that oil was first discovered there. So I did a little Googling to see what the main economic driver was in Qatar before oil. Pearl diving. From pearls to oil, and in one generation, Qatar was transformed. Geopolitically, the tech metals will be transformative too. Are we ready for the emergence of new regions, new countries that will be defined by their tech metal status? Should someone buy Greenland? Should Greenland be for sale? Or will Greenland become the tech metal Qatar of the 21st century? Do our public policies incentivize the private sector to spend the billions in exploration and development to find them, mine them, and bring them to market? Which brings us to public policy, the final challenge I want to treat. Remember that critical mineral list of lists? It's one thing to identify the metals and minerals we need, but what if, for some of them, those markets are so small as to be commercially uninteresting? You can't order the private sector to pursue and produce them, at least the US and Australia and our democratic allies can't. Governments have to incentivize and collaborate to see creative ways to bring online new production where private companies may see only risk and little reward. And it's happening. Rio Tinto is working under a grant from the US Defense Department to optimize rhenium recovery at its Kennecott copper smelter, and it's collaborated with the US Department of Energy on new ways to recover critical minerals from waste streams and historic tailings. But the effort on the part of the US government has been episodic, not systematic, certainly not strategic. And I think now, though, that's changing. We are entering a period of action. After a decade of inaction, I think we're at the brink of a policy shift. I can't overstate the impact on the US scene of the Presidential Defense Production Act Title III determination. Steve talked about it earlier today. In regard to encouraging rare earth production, not just mining, but all along the supply chain from mining to magnets. It was wrongly reported by some of the early news stories that this was a presidential executive order, an exercise of American government authority that can be enacted by one president and undone by the next, and so it lacks the permanence of a duly passed law. But Title III is law. It dates back to the Korean War and confers on the president the authority to determine strategic need for a given material. What are the tools of Title III? It gives the Secretary of Defense power to make direct investments, to support development of the material in question with loan guarantees, purchases for the defense stockpile, and even commitments to purchase, what we would call offtakes. In other words, Title III brings a warfighter focus and a warfighter urgency, a broad get-it-done authority after so many years of simply studying critical materials issues. And I would hope that the dozens more metals and minerals for which the US is 100% import dependent, would be the focus of expanded Title III action. And then there are the collaborative efforts between the US, Australia, and Canada under the umbrella of the NTIB, that's the National Technology Industrial Base. Collaboration that's happening real time. Our three nations are remarkably resource rich and together amount for roughly 30% of global GDP. Our governments may be starting late, but no one should underestimate our abilities once mobilized. To the extent this scramble for tech metals takes on the form of a tech war, metaphorically, we hope, we need to recognize, borrowing from the language of military doctrine, that the tech war is an asymmetrical war. Rising powers like China are command economies. Even Russia, to the extent it plays a part in the tech war, is what its leader likes to call a managed democracy. Delightful phrase. The state backs enterprises, directly or indirectly. Strategic goals around specific minerals can warrant a long game in which the state covers losses on the way to driving out competition and gaining market dominance. In a nation based on free markets, there's no loss-making long game. There's no US 2025. There's only bankruptcy. No government props you up, far from it. Just look at the tiny amounts of government aid on offer, certainly in the US. So you might say it sounds like we're destined to lose. Not at all. State-controlled economies have their own downsides. They pick one path, and they close the door on many others. Choosing control, they sacrifice creativity. Over in the free market, we're undisciplined, undirected, unpredictable, and because of that, we're unconstrained and energetic and innovative. Just the attributes we need to prevail in an asymmetrical conflict. Which brings me to my final thought today. And Gordon, this goes straight to your comment about the ideological purity of the market, the temptations of the ideological purity. It's a little reassurance from an author of an old book called The Wealth of Nations. Even the father of the free market, Adam Smith, foresaw back in 1776 the challenge that we face in this tech metals age. As much as he believed in free trade, he had what we would call a national security exception. In the midst of his powerful defense of free markets, he said, when it comes to gunpowder and sailcloth, that is, the means of protecting British interests around the globe and the means of projecting British power when needed, it's best not to depend on others for your source of supply. The need for gunpowder and sailcloth haven't gone away. Our gunpowder is the hypersonic missile. Our sailcloth is the wind turbine. They're just updated for the 21st century. So if we get this right, and we must, for the sake of our economies and our security, we must get this right, creative collaboration between the US and Australia will be a big part of it. And I'm pleased to be a small part of that today. Thank you.